Now, if you are just starting out your journey as a keyboard player or a producer, learning all of the different musical tricks for a particular genre can sometimes seem overwhelming. But years ago, I was given a fantastic tip. Learn everything in just one key that you find easy to play, like A minor, for example, that contains pretty much all of the white notes, or C minor, which is a very, very standard key, and then actually use input transposition should you be working inside a different key. Now, you can normally do this directly inside your DAW, or you can sometimes do it on the keyboard controllers. But this means that all you've got to do is learn one set of tricks, and then they can be applied to any key that you're working in. So anyway, enough talking, let me show you some of the classic chops from disco. And most importantly, I want to show you where you can actually break the rules and move outside of the designated notes in a particular key. Now, you may feel that you always have to adhere to the actual notes, but you don't. And knowing how and when you can actually break the rules will open up your world completely. And this is where all of the harmonic magic happens. So we're going to play in A minor, a scale that uses all of the white notes, but I'm going to show you how to break the rules and add some of the black notes in to really get some amazing color and depth into your chord sequences. But first of all, I want to show you the very first chord sequence that I ever learned. I'm going to play an A minor with 2 notes of A in the bass as well. So we're really hammering home that root of A. Simple triad on top. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this in A minor is that all of the chord shapes are so obvious because it is just basically built on the white notes. I'm going to pick up this entire chord now, and I'm going to drop it, every single part of it, by 1 white note. So from here, we go to here, which is a G major. And already something interesting is happening. And the reason why I wanted to show you this little move is simple. I want to make it very apparent that sometimes it is a good idea not to play the root of the chord on the bass. Everybody's kind of pre-programmed to be. But sometimes you can get magic. By actually having a different bass note to the root of the chord that you're actually playing. Now, this is incredibly important with things like disco or anything that may be groove orientated, because often you're running around little rhythms like this. Even though that is a little riff in itself, it pretty much hangs around that root of A. So can we drop some of these other chords on top? Of course. And yes, I did dump quite a few extra tricks in there. Let me talk you through exactly what's happening in all of these. Let's first of all look at the bass riff. So even though there are 7 notes in any given minor scale, there's 5 notes that you're going to spend more time on, and they are the first note of the scale, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and the 7th. And those 5 notes are known as the pentatonic notes, or the pentatonic scale for that given key. So that's A minor pentatonic, and it's incredibly useful for writing bass line ideas. I just want to go back to that second chord we were discussing in the sequence. Now, this is often referred to as a slash chord. No, not that kind of slash. What it means is we have one chord at the top. Here we are, G minor, and then an unexpected note in the bass, in this case, the A. So we might write that down as G major / A. And basically, wherever you find a major chord on a key, you might want to try the slash chord. And often these things will want to resolve. In other words, they feel like they want to move to another chord. For example, this always feels like it wants to go here, which then gives you the rhythm. Now, obviously, every form of music has its own distinctive rhythm, so picking out some of the things that you've heard and working out where to actually place those chords, I would say, is an endeavour and a time dramatically well spent, because you may be surprised that just learning some of these simple rhythms can change the way that you're piecing chord sequences together. Now, we've actually got exactly that move happening on the intro chords, the intro piano chords for the Stockholm project on Electric Disco II. Now, if we head back to the pre-chorus section of the Stockholm project, you'll see these kind of chord moves in action. Now, we are going to come back to these slash chords, but first of all, I need to show you some of the other tricks, because that becomes pertinent about where we actually use them. So the second thing I want to show you is what's known as suspended chords. So let's take A minor. Now, a suspended chord is technically when we take what would be the third note of this triad, and here we've got this C, and we either move it up to the next note in the scale, or we move it down one note in the scale. And the great thing about suspended chords is they remove the third, so you never actually know, if you're just playing the suspension, whether it's a major or minor chord. For example, here's A major. Now, you have no idea that it's going to go to that if we just play this. However, one thing that I would say is that it always feels like it wants to resolve one way. So this is this chord resolving back to A minor. But also, this is what it would sound like resolving to a major chord. And a similar thing happened when we used the downward suspension, in other words, this. So always keep your eye on whether you can pull a suspended chord out no matter what you're playing. Having the more open tuning and avoiding either the major or the minor part of the chord can make everything a bit funkier. Okay, let's start to get some of our chord voicing sounding a lot richer. Let's take our simple A minor triad. And that's basically voiced with an A, miss a note, and play the next one, miss a note, and play the next one. Now, what happens if we extend that pattern? So in other words, miss a note, and then play the one on top? Well, then we get a seventh, and this is an A minor seventh. And I can't tell you how important this kind of chord is for anything to do with more soulful music, and particularly in disco. Here are the principal seventh chords within the A minor scale. You've got A minor 7. Now, we're actually going to skip G for a moment. I'll show you why in a minute, and go straight to F major 7, E minor 7, D minor 7, and C minor 7. Now, you notice that I missed out the seventh that would be connected to the G chord there. That's for a very good reason. Let me play it to you with all of the, just using the notes within the A minor scale that we've selected. Now, that does sound a bit odd, doesn't it? What's even odder is the one that is situated on B. And the whole reason for that is what's happening within the bass chord that's connected to B. So if we look at the simple triad around B, we've got B, D, and F. This is B minor diminished. And as you can hear, it has a really unsettling tone, and it sounds like it just wants to resolve to a nicer chord. So when we play G major, and then add our miss that note and that top note, we actually get what's known as a G dominant seventh. Now, it has an unsettling nature again because it feels like it wants to resolve. And the most natural place for it to resolve is a fifth down, which would actually be C major. Now, let's look at a different way of voicing these seventh chords. So let's take the A minor 7 again. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of inversions, and inversions is just basically the case of taking one note and changing the octave that it's playing in. So here I'm going to take this top G and drop it down here. So we've got a much richer sound, and one of the reasons, in my opinion, why that's happening is because of this. It sounds awful by itself, but you add the bass note in. Hear how it sounds like a suspended chord? Well, now let's add the top part. And already it's getting richer. Now, then what happens if we mix some of this theory together? What about if we play within the A, we play that sus? And you hear how we're getting those movements in there. And that, for me, is one of the keys of soulful and disco music, is actually there's movement in the chords and they feel like they're trying to resolve into the next bit. Now let's look at this inverted voicing of this seventh chord again. Now, as I'm playing the root down here, I could lose it in this top bit. I could play the A minor 7 chord like this. And what's lovely about it is it's got this really open voicing. And I would say learning when not to play a note is as vital as learning when to play a note with all of this. And you will only find your own rhythm with this, or your own ideas, or your own things that you find pleasurable by experimenting. So now let's look at the F major 7, which is another one of the principal chords within A minor. Can we use the suspension? Well, let's try dropping this bit first. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? In fact, we could play all three together. Even richer, look at that. But how about suspending up? Oh, that's great, but it's quite unsettling, and it feels it wants to resolve back to that F major 7. And in fact, we could have a great little vamp going with that. Oh, now I know exactly where it wants to go now. It feels like we want to go back up to that root. But I'm just going to change one of the notes slightly. So instead of playing this, I'm just going to drop that F up to a G. So the whole thing is, let's try D. And you notice with the G, I didn't actually play the dominant 7 there. Now, it doesn't sound quite right, does it? So how about we actually change that chord to a slash? So we want to play a G. So we'll keep the G on the bass, and then we'll put an F around it. So here's our second use of a slash chord. I'm just going to invert it slightly by taking this bottom F, popping it up here. Let's see what we got. And you hear that's got a wonderfully open voicing, and the use of that slash chord right at the end pulls it back round to the beginning of the sequence. And for me, this is a perfect use of those chords. And if you go back and listen to a lot of classic disco, you'll suddenly have an aha moment where you're thinking, what is that chord? It just sounds like it wants to resolve. And resolution is so important within disco music. The reason being, for my opinion, it is the dance floor's classical music. And classical music always resolves. Hence this. So let's go back to our seventh chords for a minute. A minor 7. Now I'm going to play an interesting chord for G. That is a G major 7, but look, we're playing our first black note. and it works. And this is, for me, the first point of rule breaking. That note, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you can sharpen the sixth in a minor key, and you get... How many times have you heard that? So this is our first rule-breaking chord. And if you want to know where you've heard it the most, check this out. Okay, so armed with this new note, let's actually play back through the A minor scale, but changing that F. It's got a really bright tone to it, hasn't it? Now, it also solves the problem that we had with this B. Sounding a bit odd, because now we're playing that instead. So we get a B minor chord. So we have A minor, B minor, C major, D major, E minor. Everything's really starting to sound an awful lot easier to work with. And it's a great little trick within any minor key. We can use it on the lower notes as well. So instead of playing an F as we normally would in A minor, we can use the F sharp. And here's something really special about this particular use of that note. We don't have to stay there. We can actually then dive straight back to the standard A minor notes. So we can nip in and out of those altered scales. Let me give you another example. So let's just sum that trick up. We are sharpening the F in this key of A minor, turning it into an F sharp, and that means we can play a D major, a B minor, or a G major 7. And it just makes everything a little bit richer. So that's a fantastic trick. So are there any more? Yes, and here's a principal one I really want to nail home to you. In the same way that we just turned that D minor into a D major, we can take the E minor chord that's normally in the A minor scale and make that an E major. And listen to how that resolves back to our A minor root. And why does that work so well? Well, let's just count up 5 notes. So in other words, a fifth from A. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is the 5th note of the scale, the E. And if you ever make that chord a major, it will always want to resolve back. And if you want to make it even more strident, we turn it into an E dominant. So basically, taking that top D and inverting it back down. Now, I suppose its most famous use in disco was I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor. Here we go. And straight back round. You see, you get that wonderful resolution. Now, this is very much a classical technique. And the one thing I would say is now, the minor scale that we have been using, which is all of the white notes, isn't the real minor scale. It is the one that has been used ever since the guitar really came through, particularly the electric guitar, and the blues scale really took over. In classical music, it's much more usual to have this. And as we did with the previous example, you can drop in and out of it. Always resolve perfectly back to there. It's just one of those natural things that feels so right to us human beings. Now, all of this is obviously heavily steeped in classical theory. I'm not classically trained. I learned all of this in my own way and certainly learned an awful lot recently from watching videos. One guy I really want to show you is this channel, Julian Bradley. If you've not come across it, please check it out. And in particular, this video, all 7 church modes. It will explain why and how all of these different altered scales actually exist. And in classical theory, we pretty much always start with major scales. And the related major scale to A minor is C major. It's all the white notes again. But you see, as you play those scales, they have different colors. So now let's just investigate this a little bit further. So we've got this major 5 chord back to the minor root. And you'll notice the biggest movement is from a semitone beneath the root back up to the root. And those semitone transitions in music always feel so pleasing. Now we're going to see another one of those in a minute, but let's just talk a little bit more about this because there's some more fun to be had. You'll often hear this kind of scale in Latin music. And I've got to say, that is one little move I wish I'd have known at the beginning of my career, because I've always loved Latin pianos in house records or in club records. And I had no idea just about that simple flattening of that root note down. And once again, it's something that you can just drop in every now and again. You can switch between the normal A minor scale and into it. So that's 2 little tricks we've already found. Are there any more? Yes, there certainly are. And if you think about it, we've actually been borrowing the chords from these altered scales and then popping back down to A minor. And the most famous case of borrowing, should you be playing in a minor key, is when you borrow chords from the major key. So if we borrow chords from the scale of A major, let's just play that scale. Well, that's interesting because at the top here are the 2 notes that we've been using in those other little tricks. But now we're going to see if we can take this major third. So in other words, here's the 3rd note of A minor scale. 1, 2, 3. That's a minor third. We're going to make it major third just by sharpening it. And we're going to use that every now and again. And have you heard it in disco? Of course you have. Let me just break down what's happening to you. We're starting with the A major chord instead of a minor chord. And then we're nipping straight down to the G. We're still in A major effectively. We're using D major. Now we flip back up to the normal A minor notes. Pull that F. And then I'm using a slash chord again, F major, with G on the bass. You hear how that slash chord wants to pull it straight back to... And here, I'm actually playing an A dominant. So in other words, there's the A major, there's that dominant 7th, taking that 7th, wrapping it down the bottom. So we can either start with A major or A dominant, but we can also use our slippery little 7th note here to create an A major 7. Now we could start a chord sequence with it and then head straight back to the minor. Or we could not use it straight away and just pull it in where we feel it's necessary. Maybe now. And you can go back to the minor. Pull it in again. And you see we're borrowing that chord from an A major scale. And we use this an awful lot on the Republic project, the slower project in the F9 TRAX Electric DIsco set. Now, in the pre-chorus sections of this production, we actually lean heavily into the minor scale, and then it's got this wonderful lift as that major root chord pops back out. Now, for a more electronic use of this switch between major and minor keys, have a listen to this from the Munich project inside Electric Disco II. So all I'm doing there is modulating the third note of the scale. It's in E, this particular track, so E, F sharp and G. So that's our E minor chord. And then we change that G to a G sharp. And you hear how it switches between major and minor. And if you want to know where you've heard that in disco, I Feel Love by Donna Summer. And here's a perfect example of me just dropping the root major chord in on a minor key sequence at the end of San Fran. So let's just quickly sum up here. We started with all of the white notes, the A minor scale. Then we found out that we could add this black note. Or this one. And now, as we've shown, we can borrow this note and kind of flip that in when we fancy. So we've added already a lot of different options that we can use at particular times. But what about this note? Now, you may think, oh, you're never going to be able to use that because it's a semitone above the actual root. And it can sound really disconcerting. But I have found one chord that, believe it or not, even uses that note as the root of the chord. Lovely and warm, and it falls straight back down to the root of A minor perfectly. And this was used extensively by two of my heroes, Jam and Lewis, in their productions in the 80s. And most recently, I suddenly heard it completely out of the blue on a David Guetta record featuring Ray. Thought it was wonderful to hear that actually coming back into a modern record. Now, I've used that chord move multiple times in the chord sequences for Stockholm. See if you can pick them out.
hear it adds a degree of airiness here just before it goes back in, and a real brightness with a slightly different voicing at the end of that main A section sequence. So we've now used this black note, this black note, this black note, and this black note. The only one that's missing is this. An E flat or D sharp, whichever way you want to label it. Now, can we use that? Yes, absolutely. And let me just go back to the pentatonic scale. So A, C, D, E, G, back to A again. You can actually use it as a blues note and just flick off it. So when you think about it, that's quite amazing. We started just with 7 notes, and we found ways to enter in all of those different notes. So we can now use all 12 notes in the course of a chord sequence if we fancied. And if you're enjoying the piano sound that I'm using on all of this, this is the discogram that is part of the 8GB sound library inside of F9 TRAX Electric DIsco II. So that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you've taken a ton of incredibly useful knowledge away. Don't forget to like, subscribe, or follow us wherever you're watching this if you want to see more like this. And this is part of a 5-video series all connected to F9 TRAX Electric DIsco II. We've tried to get as much information that's useful for your production skills in there as humanly possible. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.